And I'd like to add to the hearty early good morning. And you sure couldn't tell it from the singing that anybody was tired. Thank you so much for that, Ethan, and all of you all who are singing out this morning. This morning, I'd like to take us on a brief exercise of faith building. And you'll pardon my voice. It still hasn't recovered from whatever plague it's got. But a faith-building exercise as we look at some Old Testament scriptures and some New Testament scriptures. And as surprising as the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus were and are, they were no surprise. Remember in Luke chapter 2, at the birth of Jesus, there were two people described in a fair amount of detail at the temple, an old priest named Simeon and an old prophetess named Anna. And this is what Luke says about Anna in verses 37 and 38. It says, She did not depart from the temple, worshiping and fasting and prayer night and day. And coming up that very hour, she began to give thanks to God and to speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Israel. To speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Israel. So there was this grand thought that someone was coming who would be the Redeemer of the nation. Remember also in John 4, when Jesus spoke to a Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. And she said, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And yet, remember in Luke 24, right after the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus, when there were certain disciples of Jesus who were traveling from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and one of them was remarking about how these inexplicable events took place in Jerusalem. And hey, isn't it a shame that this Jesus, who we thought was going to be the Messiah, seems to have now be out of the picture. And we can't explain these odd events about the fact that the tomb is empty. Jesus came among them and he said to them, O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Remember in Acts chapter 8, how a very eloquent Jew named Apollos from the city of Alexandria powerfully convinced the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Here's Acts 18, beginning in verse 24. Now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord. And being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. The claim in each of these cases is that any Jew, by careful examination of their own sacred literature, would have seen Jesus in there, but they might not have seen him until it was too late. They had already crucified him. Okay? Which scriptures, which prophets, I've often heard people remark, I wish I were on the road to Emmaus, right? And heard what Jesus called to their minds from the scriptures about himself. Yeah, I kind of wish that too. But we don't have to look too hard. And I don't know what might have been more convincing to a first century Jew. I know what's more convincing to me as a 21st century Christian, but here are a couple of ideas. And these are not unfamiliar to us. Even the pagans in China get it. When we take the Lord's Supper on Sunday, we often read from the book of Isaiah, chapter 53. Why? Well, because it says some really cool stuff. It says things like, he'll come as a root out of dry ground. I'm going to have to go through this list kind of quickly. He bore our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions, and by his stripes we would be healed. Like a lamb, he'd be led to the slaughter. Like a sheep dumb before the shearers, opened not his mouth. And the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. Therefore, the scripture concludes, he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. And it hardly even occurs to us anymore when we read these verses that they were written 750 years before Jesus was even born. Or maybe before we take the Lord's Supper, we'll read from Psalm 22. You know, when the Jewish rabbis wanted to call a passage from the Bible to mind, they didn't have chapters and verses like we have. So they would call a reference to mind by quoting the first verse of a reference, in this case, the 22nd Psalm. And then everybody who was in the hearing, who understood anything about, who had been schooled in the Old Testament, would know what passage he was referring to. And in this case, Jesus on the cross says these words. You know what I'm going to say, don't you? My God, why have you forsaken me? They thought, the people that were standing by that were not schooled in the law, they thought he was calling for Elias or one of the prophets to come down and save him. But if they spoke Hebrew, they would know that Eli, or in some cases you'll read Elohi, which was the Hebrew/Aramaic way of saying God. God, God. Why have you forsaken me? This is what David wrote. All who see me mock me. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Do you remember Jesus hearing those words while he's on the cross? My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. And this, of course, comes at the end of the psalm. And all the families of the nations shall worship before you. Posterity shall serve him. It shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. And we don't take the time to think of the meaning of the fact that that psalm was written 1,000 years before Jesus was born. These are just two passages that Apollos or Paul or Jesus might have called upon to show powerfully that Jesus was the anointed one and was spoken of so freely by the time he came. There are countless others. David said, "You will not leave my soul in the grave to allow your Holy One to see corruption." And yet Peter in Acts chapter 2 said, David is both dead and buried, and we're standing right here in the shadow of his tomb. Who was he talking about? Wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about somebody else. The Ethiopian read from the book of Isaiah. And he said, does the prophet talk about himself? Or is he talking about somebody else? Philip began at that very passage and preached to him Jesus. We see some things that Isaiah couldn't see. But his words in chapter 46 still ring true today. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient time things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. That's chapter 46, verses 9 and 10. The purpose of God, stated beforehand, was that the anointed one would come, that he would die, that he would be buried, and that he would be resurrected. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 said, these are the matters of first importance, that Jesus died according to Scripture, that he was buried, and that he was raised again according to Scripture. This was no surprise. We are here today to remember what they might have known back then. And I'll ask now the gentlemen who are going to serve to come forward and do so.